I want to thank you for joining the watermelon education session of this conference. Join me in thanking Syngenta. They are the 2026 Watermelon Education Conference sponsor for this part. So I appreciate what they do for us. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome our speakers today, Mr. John Bennett. He is the County Extension Agent in Wilcox County. Got some really good information on paper mulch and watermelons. And with that, John, if you're ready, we'll go ahead and get rolling.
I've got 40 minutes, and it's not going to take 40 minutes, so I'm going to try to take my time. But good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. If you were here last year, you probably heard some initial research that we started working on with the University of Georgia last year with this Smurfit Westrock paper mulch that we were able to collaborate with the University of Florida on implementing it into Georgia for the first time last year, 2020, or excuse me, 2 years ago. 2024 is 2026 now. But it's a really interesting product, and we've had a really good 2 years with it. Some challenges, some positive outcomes, but we'll see what we can figure out going forward as well. For those of you, that's too much. For those of you that don't know, Georgia is a little unique in our watermelon production system in comparison to the other parts of the nation where watermelon production occurs. So, I mean, predominantly you're going to see drip irrigation, but in Georgia, we have a good bit of our acreage. I would say conservatively, 80% of it is probably grown on small bed mulch plastic in an overhead irrigation type system, which is it's unique to us because that's not what you see in other parts of the state. But due to the rotation that we have with our row crop systems, it just makes sense for us to utilize the equipment that we have in the field already every 5 to 7 years when we're rotating in and out for watermelon season. Plastic mulch residues, pretty big issue, obviously. I mean, we see it year in, year out. We see it in fields that haven't had watermelon production in 20 years. I saw it this year in a peanut field that had not had watermelons in it in over 20 years. Still, we were inverting peanuts with plastic in the peanuts themselves. So that's a problem. And that's a unique part of this paper mulch is that you don't have to pull it. You can hair it in. It's supposed to be biodegradable, and we can hair it in, and it's supposed to dissipate in a timely manner. We're still working on that, or still trying to research what that degradation rate is. But and so going forward, just thinking about also the expense of pulling plastic post-harvest in 2025. I had Guy Hancock, our economist, one of our economists, try to update some of our numbers for plastic removal out of your fields, and we kind of came up with a good range. I don't know. I feel like we're pretty confident in the accuracy of the values there in that range, $190 to $220 an acre. So take into consideration the paper mulch is a little more expensive, or I will say a little more. It is more expensive than your traditional plastic mulches and even biodegradables, but you also do not have to incur the expense of removing that plastic, drip tape, as if you do have drip, and so on. So the paper mulch that was developed by Smurfit they've been in the development stage, I think, with the University of Florida for about 5 years now. And we were just able to collaborate with them in the last 2. So Bob Hockmuth has done a good bit of work on this in Florida and their system with drip and their soils, and they've got a great database. Also, just to let you guys know, they have some posters out there as well on their work that they've done on the paper mulch. But specifically, this talk is on our University of Georgia work that we've done the last 2 years. The paper is coated on one side and non-coated on the other. So that's when I first was able to get my hands on some delivered to my office. The coated side was outward. I didn't think anything of it. It was delivered in about February. We laid plastic in late February, 1st of March, and my first assumption was that the coated side was going to be upward because I don't know why I assumed that, but that's what I thought, and I was incorrect. So the way our system is set up, and this will make sense, is with us having overhead irrigation system, our pre-emergent herbicides that we apply are typically done in a fashion where we prep our land, we lay our plastic, and then we'll broadcast our pre-emergent herbicides like Reflex, Sinbar, and Curbit, along with if you need Roundup and Gramoxone for emerged weeds. And then what we'll do is follow that application with a ½ inch of irrigation, which Dr. Culpepper has proven to be enough of an irrigation event or rain event to vacate those residues from the plastic. Then you can transplant your plants and have a safe crop. You won't injure your plants. But because of this product being new, and I've just, once I learned that the non-coated side goes up, or the paper part of the mulch goes up, I really got concerned about applying a herbicide over that and being able to wash that off of paper. You know, that doesn't sound like you can do that very easily, vacating a residue off the paper. So my initial concern with that led to us to start looking at herbicide uses on top of it first. And then we also started working on the nutsedge part of it as well. We'll talk about that in just a second. So I don't know if you can see it, but I took a picture of this a month or so ago in my office. It's hard to tell, but on the left, you can see the dull, non-coated side of the paper. The coated side is in the middle right there, and it is an extremely thin coating, and I would love to be able to tell you what it is, but I don't. Obviously, Smurfit Westrock doesn't want anybody to know what it is either. But from what I understand and what I've been told up to the most recent conversation that I had with them, 2026 is supposed to be a non-polymer based coating, so it's supposed to be getting away from any plastic in the product going forward. So we'll see how that works out going into the future. In 2024 and 2025, so we set up our initial herbicide studies just to make sure our producers were not going to get themselves into an issue where we were injuring our plants post-transplant from a herbicide residue issue. 2024 and 2025, let's see, so what we wanted to do was to make sure our growers, we tightened everything up to the I would say maximum or extremes. We applied our herbicides. We followed that with an irrigation event within 24 hours of the application. And then immediately following the irrigation event, what I did to ensure that I was as close to any issues as possible, I basically let the irrigation event complete. I let it dry off, and I punched holes and transplanted it. So we were, basically as close to having any residues on that as possible, make sure we weren't going to have any problems, or if we did, we were going to see them. So in 2024, 2025, you can see on the left and right, these are our treatments that we went through. We had 7 treatments and an untreated check in 2024, and we had 9 in 2025. Roundup and Gramoxone were both included so that we did have assessments on if you needed to apply that for any emerged weeds, but then we also had Reflex, Sinbar, a tank mix of those, and Sandia as well. For those of you that don't know or that do know, Sandia, we don't recommend that as a post-emergence overtop application in our watermelons because of the injury or stunting that you receive from that product. So, but we did want to see how it would behave on the paper compared to plastic, because traditionally, a ½ inch of irrigation is not enough to vacate that Sandia residue. It partially binds to the plastic, so it will come off over time, even after you've planted that watermelon, and you can invoke injury to your crop going forward after that application. In 2025, we added Sonalan, which is not labeled for watermelons. You're supposed to use Curbit, but that's what we had at the time. And we also, Dr. Culpepper wanted to assess Inversa, which I believe is acetochlor, which would be what is Warrant. And he's been tinkering with it in some other vegetable systems, and he wanted to see how it would behave on the paper as well. So 2024, I just want to point out, we assessed it. So we, after transplanting, we assessed it 13 and 23 days after planting. 13, you can see the majority of them checked out. We were good to go. We did have some foliar burn at the initial assessment in our Roundup Reflex tank mix, as well as our Reflex Sinbar tank mix. We believe that came from the Reflex. We don't necessarily know why, but 10 days later, when we reassessed those treatments, there was no foliar burn on the new growth. So we don't really know why that occurred, but it checked out after the fact, and there were no issues going forward. You can see on the Sandia what we mean with the injury and the stunting that you receive going as you progress into the crop season. We got some really significant stunting, and I'll be able to show you some images of that here in just a second. In 2025, we got similar results, obviously, but we did not have any injury from the reflex, which is a positive thing. We did have some injury stunting from Sandia at the initial assessment, but we had a reduction going forward, which does indicate that there is variability on the rate that it can come off of that paper and wash into your plant hole over time. And then, of course, down at the end, Inversa had some really significant injury, about 40%, and I wouldn't recommend you apply that anyways, but it's not labeled at the moment. So this is what I mean by Sandia injury. You can see right here, this was from my 2024 study. I didn't do a really good job of getting images in 2025 because my initial trial was 80% destroyed by seed corn maggots. The second go around, I was just thankful they stayed alive. So in 2024, this was 23 days after planting. You can see, I don't know if y'all can hear me, but you can see the Sandia stunting right there on these plants and this treatment right here. Compared to a non-treated check, I mean, it is significant stunting. I mean, you just get a delayed crop set, you get a delayed crop grow off and everything. But all in all, about 40 days after we implemented the trial, they were lapping 9-foot centers and we were off to the races. And that was a really good crop year for us. So there are positives and negatives to it, but we still don't recommend you utilize Sandia over the top of your watermelon crop because it does cause significant stunting. Or we also don't recommend you applying it on your paper or plastic and expect to vacate it with an irrigation event either, completely. So summary of the herbicide work, no major plant injury occurred from our pre-emergent herbicides. We did see the foliar burn from reflex in 24, but we didn't in 2025, so I wouldn't be overly concerned with that. Don't use Sandia over the top of your watermelons or over your plastic. We only recommend that as a directed application in the row middles. And the Inversa, I would not even consider it on the paper or plastic right now because it did cause extreme significant injury and there was a significant reduction in yield. There actually was no yield on that plot whatsoever. Now, this is probably the most important or most interesting fact or characteristic of the paper mulch is its ability to suppress nut sedge penetration. For those of, plastic guys, nut sedge just rolls through it. It'll grow through concrete, but for some reason it won't grow through this paper mulch or it won't penetrate it. And that's really positive because we're extremely limited on our herbicide options for nut sedge. Our fumigant systems are challenged with what we can apply and what we can control with nut sedge. Tillage doesn't really help us too much. We can deep turn and have some help, but the tubers just persist, guys. And we all know that. So in 2024 and 2025, we implemented this into one of Dr. Culpepper's Ponder Farm plots in Tift County, and it's an extremely pressured nut sedge field, so we really put it to the test, and we had some really good results from it. In 2024 and 2025, the nut sedge just cannot penetrate the paper as long as the integrity of the paper is intact, and there is no visible soil like like a tear or your transplant hole. It's not going to penetrate the paper, which is an extreme positive. This is a good comparison just to show you the pressure that we were having under the paper and plastic in 2025. This is for the nut sedge. This is your no mulch, obviously, your LDPE right there in the middle. You can see the nut sedge rolling through it. And then on the paper on the right, you do see some nut sedge coming through, but it's only in the transplant hole. It cannot come through the paper as long as the integrity of it is there. But just another good comparison, up close image of the nut sedge going through the paper hole, the transplant hole, but not the paper in itself. So 2024, this is some data from that study. We did not put a crop on that, so there were no transplant holes applied. The only emergence of nut sedge we had in 2024 through the paper was where it tore. And I'll say this loosely, but it's not like laying plastic, so it takes you some learning to figure out how to lay the paper when compared to laying plastic. It's not as forgiving. So we're still learning how to lay it without tearing it. You know, it takes a little bit of time, but without, like I say, and I've said it 4 or 5 times already, as long as the integrity of the paper is there, the nut sedge will not penetrate. If it's coming through, it's because, there's either a tear or a weakened area of it, or it is a transplant hole. So, let's see. So 2025, this is not watermelon. This was not a watermelon study. It was a cantaloupe study that Dr. Culpepper put in at Ponder Farm, and we wanted to compare the crop grow off from paper mulch, plastic, and no mulch. The initial trial was with no herbicides whatsoever. We had 83% control of nut sedge penetration with no herbicides, just based on the quality of the product alone, compared to LDPE at 49%. That's extremely significant in my opinion, just based off of the product by itself. The positive behind the cantaloupe, or the positive behind the cantaloupes, is you can use Sandia over the top of cantaloupes. So what Dr. Culpepper did was he assessed it by itself, and then he also assessed it with a Roundup pre-plant, and then we also went over the top with a Sandia application, and I mean, we were able to check out 98% of the nut sedge coming through the transplant holes or in some tears that we did have in the trial. So looking at that, if you're in a crop system that you can utilize Sandia for, it's a great tool to accompany your herbicide program to control that nut sedge in your crop. Looking at yield, we did take the cantaloupe study to yield, and we had 8 harvests. We calculated fruit number and plot weights on an acre rate. Looking at that right there, no herbicide portion of the study, there was no significant differences between the cantaloupe fruit numbers per acre comparing paper to LDPE, as well as the study with the herbicides as well. We had no significant differences, which is a positive, which means if you replace your plastic mulch with paper, you shouldn't see any major differences in yield going forward. But we do need to continue to look at that in the future. And then looking at fruit weight, we also have no significant differences between the paper and plastic, and we also have no differences between the paper mulch and plastic mulch compared when we utilized a herbicide over the cantaloupe crop as well. So that's a positive. The big thing that I really wanted to talk to you about, guys, is there are a lot of positives to the paper mulch, but there are some challenges. I will say that laying paper is not like laying plastic. I've seen it laid with rain flow. We lay it with, and I don't even know if this is the technical name for it, but we have a machinist in Crisp County that builds plastic mulch layers. I call them Jody Builts. I don't even know if they technically have a name, but if you go into Wilcox County or Crisp County or Turner County, you're probably going to see one. And we've laid our paper mulch the last 2 years with that layer, and it does pretty well. I will say that if you have the slides instead of hilling discs, it doesn't push enough soil onto the side of the bed to hold the tuck like you need it to. So you do need some hilling discs on those. Not knocking Reddick, but we tried to lay some paper with a Reddick layer on Hort Hill in Tift County, in Tifton at the experiment station, and it was a nightmare. And I don't know, I'm not saying that you can't make it happen. I'm just saying it's probably going to take you some figuring out if you want to, if you want to lay paper with a Reddick layer. It will also tell on you on your maintenance of your layers and your machines. If your rollers aren't maintained, your bearings aren't maintained, if your brakes on your rollers aren't maintained, it tears, it doesn't stretch, and it will tell on you quick. And you're going to get pissed off, and you're going to throw it in the weeds because it's going to tear about every 50 feet, and you're going to go on about it. So you're not going to buy this product. You're not going to throw your plastic off. You're not going to throw your paper on and go to laying. It's going to take a little bit of time. It's a kind of a huggy, touchy-feely thing. So the other issue, positive and negative, is that paper mulch does start to fall apart at the soil surface, which is kind of what you want it to do. If you can get 65, 75 days out of it, I think you're doing pretty good for a watermelon crop. Then the integrity of that paper in the tuck where it's in contact with that soil consistently does break down relatively rapidly when compared to the part of the paper that is not completely submerged in like the bed top. I do know that in conversations with Bob Hockmuth in the drip irrigation systems that they have, they typically see 75, 85-ish days out of it. With us on overhead irrigation, I know we have no issues with it hanging in there until we hair it up in our system, because we don't have that consistent moisture up under the bed like they do with a drip system. And then the other issue, if you're in an extreme pressured field like we assessed with Dr. Culpepper's nutsedge field there, and I personally have never seen a field that bad, and I think he does that on purpose. But if you've got that much pressure, you can see it physically start to push the tucks out, but it will not penetrate it as long as it is the integrity of the product is there. So, and one more thing to mention, and I forgot to put it on the slide, is it is expensive, guys. I don't know specific values, but looking at the 2026 UGA watermelon crop budget, we typically allocate around $275 to $300 an acre for plastic, and you're going to be probably in a 3x range more than that for the paper. So I don't know that specifically. It's going to vary based on the plastic width or the paper width that you use. The rolls are much smaller than in row length than a typical plastic roll. You know, you're rolling 6,000 feet on a plastic roll. These guys are usually 1,250 feet because of the thickness of it. So you have a lot more man labor in changing those out as you go across the field. But it is, if you're in a situation where you need nutsedge suppression, it's a benefit. If you're in a situation where you don't want to see plastic residues in your field, it can be an extreme benefit going forward. At future outlooks on what we want to do, obviously, then it does very well with our system in terms of being able to get the herbicides off of them, and we also can resist the nutsedge. Dr. McAvoy and Dr. Intiaz have received a grant fund for assessing different fumigants and liquid nematicides. So we're going to incorporate the paper mulch into that research as well to see how it behaves with fumigants under it and see if it will retain those adequately and get what we need out of those. And then, like I said, I want to personally, and I intend to do this in 26, is look at it in terms of degradation. I want to do I basically want to bury some and just see how long it takes to reduce the percent mass to reduce over time, and just see what we can get out of it. But with that, that's all I've got. I don't know if that took 20 minutes or not, but I really appreciate my growers, Ron Arant and Clayton Bloodworth. They're great people to work with. Cass Sealing is the representative that I've worked with Smurfit Westrock, but if you have any interest in talking to him or to a sales rep, their sales representative for the AgCraft is Ken Perry, I believe. I do have his contact information. And of course, I can't, obviously thank Jenna Vance, because she keeps me and Dr. Culpepper straight when we're doing these things. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them as best as I can. Go.
All right, thank you, John. Some good information. Next speaker will be Rebecca Wentz with Syngenta. Again, I want to mention that they are sponsoring this part of the program, the 2026 Watermelon Education Conference.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I'd really just want to start by thanking all the wonderful researchers that we've got in this group. Really looking forward to a lot of the presentations today, and they're really contributing a lot to the industry as a whole. So thank you for the work that you're doing. I think I can speak for the whole Syngenta team that we really appreciate the work that they're doing, and we see a lot of the value in what they're providing to our growers and also the allied partners. So thank you for the work that you do. That's really why we're grateful to sponsor this session. We really want to be able to help spread the word of the research that our extension agents and our university partners are doing for the growers. So thank you for the work that you're doing there. At Syngenta, we're also really committed to innovation and finding genetic solutions for our growers. We really keep the growers' needs at the heart of every decision that we make. So that's why we're developing new varieties that have ideal size profiles, new disease resistance traits, as well as excellent internal quality. I think you guys are going to be excited by some of the new stuff that you see coming out from us. We've got a lot of new varieties that are set to launch in Q4 of 2027. And if you're interested in doing any trials with us to see some new varieties, we've got several of our team members here today. We've got Michael McDaniel. He's our Southeast Area Sales Manager, as well as Hunter Slade. Hunter is our Georgia Technical Sales Representative. Oh, thank you. Of course. So we've got several new varieties that have released recently. We've got 2 new firm flesh varieties. They're called Golden Crisp and Cato. Cato is a red meat watermelon. It's primarily a 45 count fruit. And Golden Crisp is a yellow meat watermelon that's primarily a 36 count fruit, has a really unique rind pattern, really striking. These 2 new varieties are unique because they've got intermediate flesh firmness, so they can be moved as whole fruit or they can be sent out as cut fruit. We've had a lot of really positive reactions from these 2 varieties. They provide a lot of flexibility to our growers. We've also got some newer products that have been addressing some grower needs. So we've got Powerhouse, Valor, and Virtue. Powerhouse is more of a mid to late maturing variety that has shown really excellent field holding ability in our trials. And then Valor and Virtue are both really early maturing varieties. They've done really well in the trials, excellent internal quality, just looking great all around. Our new standard disease package for any new varieties that we're releasing has Fusarium race 1 and Anthracnose race 1, but Virtue actually has powdery mildew resistance. So that's something that we were really excited to provide to our growers. And our newest variety is called Bahama. We just released that this year. It's a small sugar baby variety. For those of you that are familiar with Sweet Gem, Bahama is a little bit smaller than Sweet Gem, so it tends to be more of a 45 to 60 count fruit. And it delivers excellent internal quality. So in our trials, we've seen reduced hollow heart, less hard seed coat, excellent rind thickness, and great firmness on the fruit. And we've actually got a little video to show you here from Hunter Sills. He is our technical sales representative for the state of Florida.
Today we're in a watermelon field in Indiana, checking out one of our newer varieties. Compared to traditional sugar baby types like Sweet Gem, Bahama has increased flesh firmness, reduced hollow heart, fewer hard seeds, and less regrowth. Averaging between 10 and 15 pounds, Bahama is a smaller size sugar baby, which makes it ideal for specialty and roadside markets. Bahama is a widely adapted variety that can be grown throughout the U.S. In the East Coast, it's typically a little bit smaller than Sweet Gem, and on the West Coast, it's similar in size. In our trials, we've observed the Bahama has ideal firmness, high sugar content, and high marketability. Growers can expect out of Bahama to have strong yield potential and improved flexibility in their harvest window due to the increased flesh firmness. For value chain, in Bahama we've observed strong performance in its ability to ship high Brix levels and high quality eating. Bahama is a suitable variety for grafting. Some of the benefits of grafting Bahama are increased flesh firmness, rind thickness, size, and yield. From transplant to maturity, Bahama is a 79-day watermelon. It also has intermediate resistance to Anthracnose race 1 and Fusarium race 1. Bahama is available through our full count plant program as well as seed.
So if you have any questions about these new varieties, feel free to reach out to myself, Michael, or Hunter Slade. We've also got some literature set up in the back. If you have any questions, you can take some of the literature and be sure to connect with us. So thank you guys for your time today. Again, just want to say thank you to all the researchers, and let's get back to hearing their presentations. Thank y'all.
Okay, moving along, our next presenter will be Dr. Bhavesh Dudha, professor and vegetable extension pathologist with the University of Georgia, based out of Tifton. And myself, didn't introduce myself a while ago. My name's Tucker Price. I'm the county extension agent in Cook County, Georgia. Okay, I'm going to talk about the fusarium part of this presentation. Bhavesh is going to come in and talk about the anthracnose. If you're not familiar with fusarium, typically what you'll see is in a watermelon plant, you'll have 3 or 4 runners coming off the plant, And one of the runners will typically start to wilt. And you can see in this picture here, if looking at the right, it'll also take out the entire plant. So Propulse and Miravis Prime-based programs are showing some effectiveness in managing fusarium wilt. If we look at this slide here, you can see Propulse and Proline both applied at plant soil drench. You can see they reduce fusarium wilt at 42 and 55%, which that's good, but you want to see a little bit better control of fusarium. But if you look at the Propulse applied as an at-plant soil drench and Miravis Prime applied broadcast a week later, you can see you had better control at 26%. If you look at Miravis Prime applied pre-plant in a soil band with Propulse at an at-plant soil drench, you got also good protection against fusarium. So how can we use these two? You've got two different options here. You've got program 1 and 2. If you look at program 1, see Miravis Prime apply pre-plant and a soil banded spray over the transplant hole, followed by Propulse as an at-plant soil at-planting or soon after planting, followed by Miravis Prime. That's program 1. If you look at program 2, you can apply the Propulse at planting or soon after, followed by Miravis Prime application 14 days after, and then 14 days after that. So we've got two different chemical options that we can use using both those products to control fusarium. Okay, the next option is grafted plants. In our area, we do have a fusarium problem in northern part of Cook County, southern Tift County, and in Berrien County, and the surrounding counties. And some of our growers have been using the grafted plants, and one in particular I want to point out is the Carolina Strongback. It's one of the newer rootstocks that came out maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It's actually grafted onto a citron variety. If you don't know the citron in it, it's basically a wild watermelon. And there's more than one species of citron that you can use. Resistance of Fusarium race 1 and 2. It also shows some tolerance to root knot nematodes. Grafted seedlings are currently being sold by Trihista. And we started evaluating these plants in South Georgia about 4 or 5 years ago. Okay, we looked at them in Berrien, Crisp, Wilcox, Turner, and Dooley County. And the first year we did it in 2022. We basically just planted the Carolina rootstock and compared it to non-grafted seedlings. And you can see the results in Berrien and Crisp and Worth in Wilcox County, where it did show significantly less fusarium compared to the non-grafted plants. And we also saw similar results in Turner and Cook County as well. Okay, the next year, 2023, we started looking at the Carolina Strongback compared to a Citron 1 and a Citron 2 varieties, two different citrons compared to the Carolina Strongback. Also compared to a non-grafted plant, the Carolina Strongback, and then a squash rootstock. And I want to bring your attention to the bottom left-hand graph that you see there. That's the trial that we did in Cook County. It's one I was personally involved with. But you can see in the Carolina Strongback had the lowest amount of fusarium wilt compared to the other, okay, I have a pointer. Okay, that graph right there, but you can see the Carolina Strongback right there shows significantly less fusarium compared to the other plants we planted out there. Now, the other locations in Berrien, Crisp, and Wilcox County, those had similar results as well. So the Carolina Strongback is looking like a good option for our watermelon growers. Okay, in this slide we're showing Fascination, and then Fascination grafted onto the Carolina Strongback rootstock, again, which is a citron, and then Fascination grafted onto Fascination. Okay, and you can see that in 2024, it also showed significantly less fusarium compared to the other ones. Okay, last year, there's some other rootstocks being screened just to stay updated, to stay fresh, to test them out and see how they do. And you can see the Carolina Strongback in the middle there, CSB highlighted, and the one at the bottom. Both of those are citron rootstocks. And these others are squash hybrids, but the Carolina Strongback it performed well, had the greatest resistance to fusarium compared to these others, which were species of squash rootstocks. So the citron seems to be doing well as far as the rootstock. The only downside to planting a transplant, they can be more expensive, but I know in our area they are showing good promise when controlling fusarium. Okay, at this point I'll turn it over to you, Bhavesh.
Thank you, Tucker. Thank you, Tucker. So from now, I'm going to talk about anthracnose, and particularly a project which has been funded by USDA NIFA SCRI in 2023 that involves 7 different eastern United States locations and so forth, and also a USDA vegetable station. So the project is called SAM, so Sustainable Anthracnose Management for Watermelon Cucumber Growers in the East Coast. So why this project was required? So what we have seen since 2017-2018, there is an uptick in the outbreaks of anthracnose, particularly in cucumbers, but also started to grow on watermelons and other cucurbit crops. Not only in Georgia, but also in Florida, Carolinas, Virginia, Delmarva regions, and New York and New Jersey. So we all pathologists and horticulturists came together for this project, wanted to solve this issue and at least gain some support from the NIFA, and also build a toolkit for the comprehensive management for this disease for our growers. Let's look at some of the symptoms of anthracnose. Those who grow cucumbers, they are quite familiar of anthracnose symptoms. On cucumber, you can see the symptom starts with small necrotic lesions. Those lesions will expand as the disease progresses, and then you'll start seeing the short holding. So this is a typical telltale sign of anthracnose. The symptom can also appear on fruits, and you'll have fruit symptoms. Since they appear on fruits, it also has a post-harvest phase. For example, one infected fruit can actually contaminate the entire bin with the healthy fruits, like Phytophthora capsaicin in melons and peppers. In symptoms on watermelon is little difficult to diagnose early on, particularly on watermelon leaves. If you look at the small tiny lesions, these lesions can be anything. Lesions can be alternaria, can be starting of gummy or starting of anthracnose. It was quite difficult for us to distinguish them visually unless you bring these samples back in lab and do further diagnosis. But on stem, it is quite distinctive. So you will see nice necrotic diamond-shaped lesions. This is typically caused by anthracnose. And symptoms on fruits also quite distinctive, because you will see nice sunken spots with sporulation on top of the melons. All right, so the question is, anthracnose has been here since we grow melons in Georgia or in the East Coast. Why it's been a problem now? Traditionally it's been caused by Colotorchicum orbicularis, which is the pathogen that causes anthracnose. But why are we seeing the uptick in the outbreaks? So the question we asked is to see, are we dealing with a new species complex? For that, we did a comprehensive survey across the East Coast that involved close to 45 different field surveys, where we went to these commercial fields for in 24 and 25, and took the samples, identified what species we're dealing with. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Georgia survey. So these surveys were done in these counties, in Dodge, Wilcox, and then Toombs, Telfair, Colquitt, and Tift. Total 14 commercial fields were surveyed in 2025, but the additional fields are surveyed in prior years. So in 2025, 6 watermelon fields, 7 cucumber field, and 1 muskmelon field were sampled. Why not others? Because these are only fields that had an outbreak, known outbreak. And when we worked our cooperative extension agents, and they helped us out to identify these fields. So overall, we collected close to 329 isolates, and that were subjected to further diagnosis. So these are some of the symptoms we observed in the field. Look at the symptom of melon in the middle. This is quite severe. These are the symptoms we observed in Grover's Field during our survey. Anyway, let's look at the cucumber. In cucumber, you can see the locations of the fields, number of isolates collected, and number of isolates that were detected as a Colotartric orbicularis. So we found most of the cucumber anthracnose, close to 96 to 100%, are caused by Colotartric orbicularis. Okay. Whereas in watermelon, it's a mixed bag. In some fields, we have close to 1/3 of the infection in melons are caused by orbicularis, whereas in some fields, 100% of the infection caused by orbicularis. So in watermelon, we are seeing some other species too, for which we do not know if those species are actual causal agent of anthracnose. So they are currently under characterization for their pathogenicity on watermelon and cucumbers. But at least we can say that orbicularis are the predominant species in cucumber, and probably, I would not say predominant, but one of the major contributors in watermelon in Georgia. Now, what about the other states in the East Coast? Other East Coast states also have a similar trend, particularly in Florida and Carolinas. They're also finding a lot of orbicularis. But in Northeast, we have some different situation. In New York and New Jersey, orbicularis is the major species in melons, but in Virginia, we are finding some other species too. And also in Delaware, we are finding more magnum rather than Colotartric orbicularis. So more or less, out of 7 states, 5 states have orbicularis, and other states have a mixed populations of species. So the one challenge is with the orbicularis is that we never had any specific detection assay for diagnosis. So our team worked on identifying a detection assay, and it's a detection assay based on PCR and PCR primer, and we're able to develop an assay that can distinguish orbicularis from other species. So what you are seeing here is a gel image where all the orbicularis isolates were able to be amplified here in a PCR, where all the non-orbicularis isolates did not show any amplification. That shows at least we have some reliable assay to distinguish orbicularis isolates from non-orbicularis isolates. We also looked at the specificity of these isolates across all the non-orbicularis, and it panned out really well. So all the orbicularis, you can see positives, but all the non-orbicularis and other watermelon pathogen species, they're all negative. So more likely, this particular assay has a lot of promise. Okay, now what did we do with those isolates we collected, all the commercial field isolates? So our mycologist in University of Georgia, Dr. Marion Brewer, and her PhD student, Ms. Rashmi Pokhrel, what they did, they looked at the sensitivity of those isolates to azoxystrobin. Azoxystrobin is one of the most important fungicide traditionally our growers would rely on against anthracnose. But lately, we are seeing a lot of field insensitivity or field failures with azoxystrobin. So we wanted to see what's happening with these isolates. They are still sensitive to azoxystrobin. When they looked at the EC50 values of these isolates across, they found all the blue bars are the cucumber isolates with high EC50 values. It means these isolates are less sensitive to azoxystrobin. So all the cucumber isolates are less sensitive, but good thing is all the watermelon isolates are still sensitive. They still have a low EC50 values. So this shows in cucumber, azoxystrobin resistance might be coming, whereas in watermelon we are still safe. Quadris or Cabrio would still work. So they also looked at the genetic basis of this insensitivity or resistance in cucumber isolates. So they found that there is a point mutation in their F129L. In their cytochrome B gene, where F129L mutation was observed only with the resistant isolates, but not with the sensitive isolates. So looked at these resistant isolates. So their C was changed to A. So that one point mutation over here made the fungus resistant to or insensitive to azoxystrobin compared to other sensitive isolates. So, although they also looked at other point mutations, they did not find any genetic basis of resistance with respect to other point mutation. This is the only one that was observed. So what about the fungicides? In our grant, we also mentioned that we'll help our organic and conventional growers to have their fungicide options. So when we looked at the watermelon organic fungicides options against anthracnose, we did not find any of the fungicide to be effective against anthracnose. So these are all the OMLI listed fungicides we used. This is consecutively we used in 3 years. We never see any activity. So this is the last year we had tried. So look at Garda, Oxidate, Howler, Lifeguard, Macrothiol Dispraise, OSO, Timorex, and so forth. They are not significantly different from non-treated check. We had a Bravo by itself in this particular trial. As a check, it did perform well compared to the non-treated check and all the organic products. What about the conventional products? Conventional products, whatever is rates, did not work this year. The only product that worked was Proline and Miravis Prime. These are the two fungicides that worked. So what we are recommending, use these fungicides judiciously in rotation with the contact fungicides like a Manzed and Bravo. All right, in this project we also had a seed pathologist. They are looking at the seed-borne aspect of Colototrichum orbiculare. Can they be seed-borne or not? So Dr. Ron Walcott, our seed pathologist, and his postdoc, Dr. Blake Oakley, what they did, they collected infected fruits from outbreak fields in New York and also from Carolinas and Georgia. And they were able to just run these New York isolates, New York seed samples, and they found that the pathogen can be harbored in the watermelon seeds. Okay, again, this particular trial was from an infected field which have been inoculated, and these seeds are not treated. So this is from a research plot. So the main thing is that they found the first association of Colototrichum orbiculare with infected watermelon seeds. They also did a trial. They also tried to find how seeds get infected with Colototrichum orbiculare. So in their trial, what they did, they started inoculating the flowers, female flowers, with Colototrichum orbiculare, and they found the resulting seeds that developed in those fruits, they were positive. Look at the positive detection from the seeds that came from the flowers. So more likely, the female watermelon flowers can be a source of pathogen invasion and ingress into the seeds. The work is still ongoing. What about the resistance? So our cucurbit breeder, Dr. Cecilia McGregor, what she did, she leveraged the QCAP core collection, which is a part of another Sierra project. They have a core collection of close to 350 lines which are sequenced from cucumber and close to 250 lines from 300 lines from watermelon. So those those lines were screened under high disease pressure in the field for last season, and this is what they found. The particular field trial was inoculated with RES2, not RES1, RES2. The one thing which I missed during characterization, during our commercial survey, all the assets which we collected, we found the RES2 was more prevalent in watermelon, where RES1 was more prevalent in cucumber. Going back to the resistance screen, when she looked at the resistance against RES2, she did not find much in Citrullus lanatus background. For example, watermelon background, there's not much resistance. Most of the resistance was in Amarys background, which is still, it's a wild, it's quite a distant relative. It's going to take a lot of time to integrate into watermelon. But at least there is a source of resistance, which is in Amarys. Look at this field. At the end of the season, each and every plant in different plots are dead, but these are the resistant plants which were alive. Dr. Ted McAvoy, he also screened the commercial lines of melons, and he found, except fascination, none of the commercial lines had any level of tolerance. So even commercial and fascination had a disease incidence, good bit of disease incidence in ADPC, but it can tolerate far better than other lines. And again, this particular trial was inoculated with the RES2 isolate of Colototrichum orbiculare. What about fungicide? Fungicide trials. So fungicide trials in melons in 2024, I showed you 2025 data. In 2024, we had some lines that worked, some fungicide that worked, and some did not, except the consistent performance was with Proline and Miravis Prime. And this is, I think I already showed, but in 2025, none of the commercial product worked except Proline and Miravis Prime. So these are two fungicides that were quite consistent across the board. Some of the examples. This is my non-treated check. This is a Proline. This is a Manzet. So what I do, I also rank my fungicides based on their performance for last 4 or 5 years. I've been doing the anthracnose trial since 2021. So this year we started ranking. So these are our top products in melons. Proline, high to moderately effective. Topsin, Luna Experience, Merivan, Merivis Prime, Aprovia Top. They are still moderately effective. Bravo is less effective by itself, but if you compare the Bravo with all the Omri listed fungicide, it is more effective. But Bravo, we highly recommend Bravo to be used as a rotation partner. What about Quadris? Quadris is less effective. Cabrio less effective. Quadris Top, I would say, if you want to use Quadris, I would rather use Quadris Top because the top portion, which is the difenoconazole, will provide more boost to Quadris. So it's moderate to less effective. Well, so let's rehash before I acknowledge. So across the East Coast, we have Clototrichum orbicularis. Some of the orbicularis isolates in cucumber are less sensitive to azoxystrobin. Probably they are less effective to Quadris and Cabrio. But in watermelons, Quadris and Cabrio may still work. That is also evident in our trials, although I have not shown you cucumber data. But in cucumber data suggests that Quadris and Cabrio doesn't work at all. Whereas in watermelon, it does have some juice left. So in watermelon, with respect to Omri listed products, there are no Omri listed products that are effective against anthracnose. But with respect to conventional products, we do have some leverage with Proline and Miravis Prime. But there are other fungicides that can be utilized, especially premixes of group 7s and group 3s and group 9s that can be utilized as a rotation partner. And most importantly, use Bravo in between your sprays. With respect to resistance, we don't have a lot of resistance against RES2 in melons in Citrullus lenitus background, but we do have some promising lines, some promising resistance in Citrullus amaris. With respect to seed, this is the first time we have shown empirically the seed can be a source of inoculum, and that's why I think seed aspect or seed treatment aspect is a critical part of managing this disease. So with this, I'd like to acknowledge the funding agencies. I'd like to acknowledge my postdocs, graduate students, my cooperating extension agents, and collaborators. So I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you. Actually, we both will be happy to take questions on Fusarium as well as anthracnose. Yes. Not, because the grafted rootstock is against Fusarium because it's soil-borne and it's airborne. So the sign would still be one of your commercial lines. So the responses of those signs we know. So that's why we did not. Mm-hmm. Any questions on fungicides? Okay. All right. Yes, next speaker is Dr. Emmanuel Torres, and you can introduce him. He's here.
Okay, we're going to restart our watermelon session. And last speaker, Dr. Emmanuel Torres, is going to be our last presenter, all right?
Thank you for staying. We are starting just in time. Again, my name is Emmanuel Torres. I'm an assistant professor at North Carolina State University. I I don't work a lot with cucurbits, but I do a ton of work in irrigation and nutrient management in vegetables. So the whole premise here is that if you're going to get something out of the presentation is that regardless of the crop, as long as you manage the fundamentals of irrigation and fertilization, you can apply that to most of the crops out there. So when it comes to watermelons, they're high water consumers. They however don't uptake water at the same rate at the different stages that the crop grows. So for example, at the beginning of the crop is somewhat resistant to water stress, but once you get to flowering and fruit development, those tend to be the key moments where you want to really pay attention to that water consumption. So flowering, fruit set, and fruit expansion tend to be really important here. And, as long as you're consistent with the water availability, and especially during the mixed season, in most cases, you're going to be doing somewhat fine. The idea is that you want to hopefully shoot for that sweet spot close to field capacity. If you don't know what field capacity is, we're going to talk about that in a second. But as long as you are somewhat close to that, things tend to work out really well. Another thing in the introduction that I wanted to mention, there's no way that you can divorce or separate irrigation from nutrient management. The presentation is split in between irrigation and fertilization, but at the end of the day, once you're in the field, you're going to have to combine those two. There's no way that you can do one without considering the other, or the other way around. For watermelons in particular, it's extremely important to pay attention to how you manage your water, because again, that's going to influence your nutrient availability. But more than that, it's because most of the roots are going to be in the surface, or pretty close to the surface of the soil, especially if you're working with plasticulture. So within those first 12 inches, that is going to contain your majority of the roots. So what does that mean? It means that if you're irrigating and for whatever reason you over-irrigate and leach nutrients, once they pass that threshold of 12 inches, you don't have that many more roots collecting that water or nutrients. Most of that fertilizer in the soil profile is either going to be lost, or it's going to take a fairly long time to be collected back by the crop. So your focus in most cases is going to be high frequency, low dose when it comes to water and fertilizer, just because of the nature of this particular crop. So again, being consistent on how you do that is pretty important. Within the different crop stages though, if you were to, let's say, make mistakes for lack of a better term, during the vegetative stage, when you just start growing the crop, is going to be one of the stages that is not ideal, that the plant is under stress. But if it has to be under stress, it better be under stress on that stage. Because once you get to flowering, fruiting, that's where things get really complicated. That's when you start losing flowers. That's when the pollination doesn't really happen, and then you don't really have a crop out there. So if you really want to pay attention to a specific stage of the crop, fruiting, flowering and fruiting, fruit set and fruit expansion in particular, because most of what the watermelon is going to be made of is water, are the key parts of the season that you really want to keep that water and fertilizer pretty tight. After that, during the maturation, excess water can maybe dilute the solution within the watermelon, so it might not taste really well. If you had a ton of rainfall, or if you're over applying water, or if you're low in fertilizer, but overall the plant is not going to die. In particular, your yield might not be particularly affected. The taste will, but at least the plant is having a fruit and you're harvesting something. But the key parts are flowering, fruit set, and for sure fruit expansion, so you can actually get that yield. The key point, again, irrigation errors during those stages, pretty big deal. Which again brings our attention to two things, which are the frequency and volume of water that you're going to use. The presentation has pretty basic stuff to a certain extent, and then as we go, we're going to get more advanced. But frequency and amount and volume are the two things that you're kind of aiming for, right? So ideally, in a perfect world, because it doesn't work like that all the time, you want to shoot for frequent small irrigation events. Again, this goes back to the depth of the roots of the plant. So, it's just to keep that soil profile, the top soil profile, kind of moistened with everything, all the nutrients in there. And that's going to hopefully increase your marketable yield improve your fruit size, because most of the water is going to be collected by the plant, and of course the efficiency of the use of your water fertilizer should increase. In contrast, if you were to do long intervals, more likely than not, you're both going to leach most of the nutrients and likely push the water down so far that the plant might not collect it, which is going to translate to expenses in labor and fuel. And I'm not sure that you guys pay for water, but if you were in California, you will be paying for more water, right? So it's just a key thing to consider. Two scenarios that you can have if you're not managing your water well. The one that we tend to fear the most is under-irrigating. That's why I keep going back to try not to over-irrigate, because the fear of most people is like, I might be lacking water. Let me make sure that I really put in the water that that is necessary for the plant. And if you were to under-irrigate, which is understandable, you're going to have a reduced fruit set, limit your fruit expansion for sure, because again, the plant is moving the water inside the fruit, and lower your total yield. But I will say that sometimes is not considered as important is over-irrigation, because over-irrigation, which tends to be the scenario that I see the most out there, is going to create similar, if not worse, situations. So watermelon doesn't necessarily like wet feet, so having a really wet soil is going to be a pretty challenging situation, especially for watermelons. Reason why, at least in my experience, most of the watermelon production on cucurbits are usually planted in sandy soils. So excess water, it can bring many issues, from killing the plant when it's too small because there's not enough oxygen in the root zone, and promote shallow rooting because the roots are just pulling the water from whatever it is, and if the water is not distributed evenly, because there's a lot of them, the roots might not develop too well. Of course, it's going to leach those nutrients down, and you guys are going to see the effect of having enough nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus inside on the fruit. And of course, the efficiency is just not there. So, like I was saying, in the field, if you're working on sandy soils or coarse texture soils, then you're getting to that situation where it's pretty easy to over-irrigate just because you don't really see that water going through, and you don't see the water kind of sitting in the soil. So if you're in a clayey soil, it's pretty common to understand that you're over-irrigating because most of that water is going to be in that surface and it's going to be somewhat muddy. But if you're in a sandy soil, it's pretty common for you to over-irrigate just because you don't see that water accumulating in the top. Regardless, you might be leaching things out. So what are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to measure these things? According to research in many crops, not just watermelon, if you were to make, if you have all the money in the world and you want to make the best choice, soil moisture sensors is the way to go. They're going to allow you to basically take a picture of what is happening in the field, only in the location where the sensor is at. So if you have multiple textures in your field, pretty big field, maybe different slopes, the water holding capacity of those fields might be different, and you might need different sensors. Regardless of that, it is a great tool that allows you to basically take a snapshot of what is happening out there. The way I explain this to my students when I'm giving the class is, if you were to imagine a 3D environment of your plants, this is how they look under the field. This is an example for potatoes, for one of the studies that I was doing. You can have either one sensor or a single instrument that have multiple sensors at multiple depths, and those depths are the places where you're going to be measuring the water concentration. From there, given that you're just installing the sensor on an imaginary column, if you will, near the plant, what is going to happen is that you're going to take the information that you're getting from that sensor, and you are going to relay that information to the overall, area where the plant is growing. So you're basically going to make a calculation for that area and assume that for the rest of the plants that is happening on that particular field. Reason why that is important is because if you see this diagram, if you imagine a cross-section of the soil, you can take the data out of the soil moisture sensor and basically create a 3D evaluation of how the water is distributed in your field, which is right what you see here. On this example, the irrigation was subsurface, so it was buried at about 12 inches. So that's why the top part is going to have less water. If you see the column on the left side, the wider-ish part is the one that is containing less water, and the blue part is the one that contains the most water. That's a rain event, and that's followed by an irrigation event. And you can see how the water accumulates lowering the soil profile that probably you will wish for, that particular crop. It might not be the case for watermelons, but in this case, if you were to put your watermelon on top, like I said, you want to shoot for those first 12 inches, and in this case, you will have most of your water below that, which is not what you want. But it's a great example of what you can do with this kind of information. The other thing that I would like to bring to your attention is 3 terms that you probably have seen before. The first one is saturation, which basically means the amount of water, the maximum amount of water that the soil can hold, depending on your soil type. That level is going to change, so you can measure that in percentage of the volume of the soil. We call that volumetric water content, or you can translate that to gallons or any unit of volume that you like. The second one is field capacity. Field capacity is basically how much water the soil can hold after everything that is affected by gravity is pulled out of the soil profile. So once everything kind of leaches naturally, whatever water is left, that's what we call field capacity. The way you can imagine that is if you take a sponge, the same one they use to clean plates in your kitchen, and you were to fill that sponge with water, it's going to be dripping water, but at some point it's going to stop. Once it stops, it doesn't mean that the sponge is dry, it's just holding water, but it's not leaching water anymore. So that will be equivalent to your field capacity. If you were to squeeze the sponge, you can get more water out, but the gravity is not pulling more water. So the same happens in the soil. And then you got your permanent wilting point, which is basically the point where you got so little water. There still might be water in the soil, but it's so little that your plant cannot really uptake the water anymore. And the water that is inside the stem and the roots and the leaves, we call that the water column inside the plants, basically breaks. The plants is basically like a vacuum system pulling the water out of the soil, but it gets to the point that if it is too dry in the soil, that vacuum kind of stops and it breaks, and it creates cavitation, which is basically another term for a hole inside the plant. Once that happens, that tissue dies, the plant doesn't recover. That is the difference between a plant that might wilt in the day and during the night it might recover, and a plant that might wilt in the day and never recover. It's basically the amount of water that was in the soil. And we call that permanent wilting point. We do not want to get there. So back to the whole soil thing. You've probably seen this before, but depending on your soil type, you're going to have different water holding capacities, right? Sand being the one that holds the less, clay being one of the ones that hold the most. But I wanted to bring something to your attention. Usually the water holding capacity is a range depending on the soil type that you have. And how does that work? If you were to, let's say, go to your field and collect 2 samples from 2 different fields, send it to the lab. It might be the case that the first sample is 75% clay, 5% silt, and 20% sand, which is pretty common for a clayey soil. So within the texture triangle that most labs use, it's going to be considered a clay soil. The second sample might have 50% clay, or 55, 35% silt, and 10% sand. And within the triangle, still consider a clayey soil because the majority of that is going to be clay. But here's the kicker. Both of those are clayey soils. And if I were to, sorry, I'm looking at a different one here. But within them, there's going to be differences in the way they collect water, the whole water, because the amount of clay and sand that they have is different. Hence the range. That range that you guys see there, where it says clay on that little table right there, that 1.2 to 1.5, that difference, once you translate that to per acre base and per gallons, is the same difference between 32 gallons to the acre and 40,000 gallons to the 32,000 gallons to the acre and 40,000 gallons to the acre. So that range right there is extremely important. How do you use this? Ideally, you want to try to create water holding capacities for your soil. There are some labs that you can send samples and they might do water retention curves for you. And if you cannot do that, just be conservative. Get your texture analysis from a lab and identify what type of soil you have, and then just take the lower end of the range and just assume that that's how much water you can hold in that soil. Because more likely than not, you're going to be somewhere in the middle, so you want to be conservative on that. How I want you to think about this, though, even if you don't do all that, your job is to try to irrigate between your field capacity, which I already explained, within your particular soil type. Let me see if I can use a pointer here. There we go. So within your particular soil type, your job is to identify where your field capacity is, basically how much water you hold after everything kind of leached naturally. and what is your permanent wilting point. And you want to try to keep your irrigation in between the field capacity and a threshold before the permanent wilting point. For watermelons and for most specialty crops, for that matter, you want to be about 70% to 50% of the field capacity. So that middle line right there represents the threshold where you don't want your water content to drop lower than that, again, in your particular soil. I mean, if you see this trend right here, this is just different types of soil. So you might be in a medium type soil, and your field capacity might be closer to 25% volumetric water content. You don't want to go, to lower than 20, never closer to 15 in this example, because this is cutting it too close to what could potentially be your plants dying. So if you ever seen the graphs that you can generate from a soil moisture sensor, you may see the lines going up and down, up and down. Ideally, you want to, the up part is going to be close to the field capacity, and the lower part is going to be close to that threshold, which could be 50% or 70% of the field capacity. And then you just keeping your irrigation in between those 2 points, that's it. If you can do that, your irrigation is well managed. You're not wasting water because you're not putting too much water, and definitely you're not letting your plants dry out. So that's what I would like you guys to shoot for. And of course, all this is going to be interacted with the nutrients. Because at the end of the day, the water is what is moving the nutrients out there. So without water, you cannot move the fertilizer. Without fertilizer, plants cannot grow regardless of how much water they have. So they're always going to be combined. So a few key things about the irrigation before we shift to nutrients. Watermelons, high water demand, depending on the stage. If you were to pick 2 stages where you really, really want to pay attention to, flowering, fruit set, and fruit development is going to be, where you want to be. Do not let your plants get into stress. But if you need to choose an area where you're going to put the irrigation, make sure it's there. Frequent, low volume irrigation tend to be better than long and really separated irrigation events. Over-irrigation tends to be one of the most damaging parts because I haven't really seen many fields that are under-irrigated, but I've seen a ton of fields that are over-irrigated because it's hard to tell by the naked eye that you're over-irrigating. How you fix that, pay attention to your texture. And if you can, get a sensor. Sensors, the technologies are getting cheaper by the minute. Right now, you can get sensors to close to $200, which are with pretty good accuracy in the field, and they have multiple depths. If you want to get more fancy, maybe connected to your phone, you might be looking at $600 to $800, but it's a great tool that you can, it's really going to help you with your irrigation. And that's how you make your decisions when it comes to that. So moving into nutrients though, watermelons are also a high nutrient demanding crop. Nitrogen is going to be somewhat high, not so much because the total rate is high, but rather because the number of dates between planting and harvest it tends to be less than, for example, solanaceous crops. So the amount that you need per day of growing tends to be somewhat high. The yield, it tends to be good. It is, in terms of if you were to use something like 2 kilograms, well, not to use, I'm sorry. The plant is going to be using about 2 kilograms of nitrogen, about 0.8 kilograms of phosphate, and 3.3 of potash. But this is just the consumption internally of the plant. You're not really applying that because once you do your applications, you're going to have to go a little higher because the soil is going to be containing some of that fertilizer. Some is going to be lost by mechanically just the way that you apply it. So at the end of the day, your best bet is just to follow the recommendations that we have in, for example, the Southeast Vegetable Handbook for watermelons. There might be some differences based on the cultivar that you use, but more often than not, the changes are not going to be too big. Usually it's something between 10 and 50%. And it's something that you can adjust in time, right? So looking at the big three, nitrogen, central, but extremely easily mismanaged. The key with nitrogen is that it's really mobile in the soil. So, like I was saying, if you over-irrigate, which tends to be the thing that happens the most, it's pretty easy for you to leach nitrogen out of the soil profile, especially those 12 inches that I was telling you about on the surface. Once you pass that, the plant might still uptake it, but it's going to be a bit tougher, and you're definitely going to see some effects on the final crop. So under drip fertigation systems, what it's seeing is that frequently, moderated to high rates very frequent tend to be, the best bet when it comes to nitrogen. So the timing of application it tends to have a pretty bigger effect, I would say, than the actual rate. When it comes to fertilization, you got 4 hours. You got your placement, your timing, your rate, and your source. In these cases where your soil profile and the depth of your roots is not that much, the frequency of application is definitely a big deal. Then, of course, you got your rate. So, for example, the suggestion that we have in the vegetable handbook is about 150 pounds to the acre of nitrogen and 152 pounds of potash to the acre. But this is going to be influenced by the way that you manage your irrigation, like I was telling. So here's a good example of that. In this study, they were using 2 rates, 150, which is the base rate that I'm suggesting based on the manual, and 265, which is basically 100 pounds more. And the main difference among others, is the way they manage the irrigation. If you see the 16 to 20% on where it says high rate, that basically means that for that rate, they were using more water than the soil can hold. And for the recommended rate, they were looking at 8 to 12% volumetric water content, which is closer to the actual field capacity of that particular soil. And what I want you guys to pay attention to is this graph right here, which is the nitrogen content in the leaf. It did start pretty high because of the pre-planned applications that they did for this particular study. But by the end of the season, all of the treatments kind of came together around 2% nitrogen tissue. But one of them was using 100 pounds more of nitrogen. So that didn't really influence the concentration of nitrogen within the plant, meaning that you don't have to use a higher rate. That higher rate is not necessarily going to translate to a better plant as long as you manage your irrigation well enough. And that's basically what we have seen in many other crops. So it's not an exclusive thing to watermelons. In terms of phosphorus, the demand is somewhat moderated, like many other crops. I will say best way to kind of figure out what you need to do with phosphorus is with your soil analysis. The reason for that is because phosphorus doesn't move too much in the soil, but it tends to be available depending on the pH that you have in your soil. So depending on what is going on in your particular soil, that availability might change. And because we don't know until you actually send a sample to the lab, your best bet might just be to do the soil analysis and see what recommendation comes back for your particular soil in your area for watermelon. So it tends to be a safe bet when it comes to phosphorus. And then potassium, of course, is going to be critical for your quality and yield. Potassium usually for most crops is going to be the element that is going to allow the concentration of sugars within the plant cell. This translates basically to the size of the watermelon and the flavor of the watermelon. There are other elements playing a role there, but the amount of potassium that you add and that is available and uptaken by the plant is going to definitely influence the size of the final watermelon and the taste of the watermelon. So potassium tends to move in the soil. It's a positive cation, and depending on your cation exchange capacity, which I'll talk about in a second, it might be sequestrated by the soil or not, depending on the type of soil that you have. But it's definitely a key thing that you want to pay attention to. Good rule of thumb: frequent applications with small doses might save you the headaches of you leaching out the potassium, especially if you are in a location where it's prone to a lot of rainfall, which might also leach those nutrients out. So timing and uptake pattern are definitely a key thing. Many studies have shown that if you were to supply your fertilization based on the stage of your crop in combination with the practices that allow for a higher efficiency of the application, your inputs you might be able to decrease your inputs and maintain the yield that you want. There are other new technologies out there that are coming out. This, for example, is a paper that it came out 2 years ago. But basically, they were testing aerated irrigation, which means that within the irrigation line, they were pushing water, fertilizer, and air. Not oxygen, but actually regular air. The idea is that they didn't want to saturate the soil, so they developed this system where you can kind of mix a particular concentration of air within the solution, so the concentration of air or oxygen, if you want to say that, in the soil was somewhat higher. And it's interesting because that AF, hopefully you guys can see it on this side, on the left side of the circle. basically were the treatments that were receiving that particular treatment. And you can see how within the circle, there's a partitioning of nitrogen for the root, stem, leaves, and fruits, and how within those tissues, it is a bit higher for those treatments that were receiving that air. You don't need to necessarily use this kind of system, but it's definitely another proof that if you manage your irrigation correctly, that is going to allow a good balance between the nutrients, water, and oxygen or air in the soil, which is going to allow enhance uptake by the plant. Like I was saying, many cucurbits don't like wet feet, so this is just another way to see it. This is a partitioning of potassium, and the most easy to spot is sorry, the other one was phosphorus. The most easiest to spot is just the partitioning and uptake of potassium in those treatments with extra air, if I will, in the soil. A couple other things to keep in mind, fertigation versus conventional fertilization. Fertigation is higher in efficiency. It might be a bit more expensive. Conventional, yes, it's traditional. Many people know how to do it, but at the end of the day, you're likely going to use a higher rate compared to fertigation just because the efficiency of uptake is going to change. You're not going to be there every single week applying dry fertilizer. But fertigation, you can actually do that. So depending on your area and your system, one might be better than the other. It kind of depends on what kind of system you have in your farm. Some limitations that you might see out there is over-fertilization and under-fertilization, of course. Again, I think the fundamentals are more important here, the specific recommendations. As long as the water is well managed and the recommended rate tends to be followed, you shouldn't necessarily see these issues unless you have a really particular situation in your field. A lot of rainfall, maybe a lot of underground water kind of coming in from the water tables coming in and leaching things out. But those are really specific. In most cases, as long as you manage your water well and follow recommendations for the rate, you should be good to go. So a couple things to keep in mind when it comes to nutrient. I put watermelon nutrient demand is high, but it kind of depends on the timing of the stage of the crop. Excess nitrogen is more common that actually have a deficiency because most people tend to over apply, which is in many cases a waste of money, especially with the rise in fertilizer price. Potassium is essential for fruit quality, easily leach out, so it's something to keep in mind. Soil test for phosphorus is key. Fertigation is one way to go if you have the option to do it. And nutrient management, it needs to be integrated with irrigation. I just have 3 more concepts that I want to go through before I finish. First is pH. We all seen this, but I just want to remind everybody about the importance of this. Especially for watermelon, all cucurbits or most crops, you really want to keep yourself within the range of pH in the soil solution that is adequate for your plant. And I say soil solution because many times we pay attention exclusively to the pH of the soil, but that is not really what the plants are looking at, because the second factor in this equation is the pH of the water. So you might have a pH in your soil and a different pH in your water, depending on where your water is coming from. At the end of the day, the plants are actually seeing an interaction between those two, and we call that soil solution. So that is the pH that the plant is being affected by or is reacting to. So understanding those 2 pH or sampling the soil solution on your soil is key to understand what kind of pH you're looking at inside. Depending on the pH, if you are in the adequate range, everything is fine, you don't need to change anything, but in some cases you might be too acidic or too alkaline. And depending on that, my recommendation is to talk to an expert. It could be an extension agent, it could be a private lab or the state lab, or one of the specialists, just to have specific recommendations for your field. For example, ammonium-based fertilizers might be an option that tend to acidify the soil, while nitrate-dominant fertilizers tend to exacerbate the alkalinity of the soil. So in some situations, and I'm not saying this always is the case for every single field, but in some situations, watermelon grown in calcareous soils can be improved their performance if ammonium nitrogen were to be used in those particular conditions just to offset that pH change. It's just an example. It's not a clear-cut recommendation, but what I'm trying to say is that there are ways out there that you can use to try to manage that on top of, changing your water source, if you will, or liming your soil, which takes a really long time in some cases. At the end of the day, pH is going to influence all your nutrients, your big tree plus your micronutrients. So, there are a ton of tables out there just to keep in mind, what is important, what nutrients might be available, what nutrients might not be affected by the changes in your pH. But it's definitely something that we cannot forget. It's extremely important, especially with drip irrigation, because the pH changes tend to be more localized, because now you're dripping the fertilizer in specific spots in the bed. So the way you're sampling your soil needs to consider how the water moves based on your drip irrigation, right? So if you have your planting bed, maybe taking the sample from the shoulder of the plant might not be the best bet, because most of your fertilizer is going to be under or closer to that drip. So maybe between both drips or two drips within one line might be a better sampling spot from your bed, just to kind of understand what your plants are perceiving, right? So water testing and soil testing regularly, not necessarily multiple times within the same season, but definitely every season, is essential for you to be able to manage this. I just want to lay this out, because I've seen examples in North Carolina. These analyses are not just paperwork. The idea is that you take the information and actually, make recommendations based on that, or make changes based on that. Everything might be great, but if not, then, reach out to a specialist or talk to your agent and kind of create a map or a pathway to changing or modifying or arranging situation, or create a plan so you can fix what is the problem that you're seeing based on the results of your analysis. The second part that I wanted to mention is cation exchange capacity. People don't really pay attention to this part, but it's extremely important. Depending on your soil type, many sandy soils might have a pretty low cation exchange capacity, and that's why they tend to leach out things. But if you have a soil that has a high cation exchange capacity, that is basically going to hold down into the cations. In many cases, that's going to be your potassium, calcium, magnesium, and ammonium in some cases. And that is going to allow a couple things. First, it's going to reduce the leaching potential of your soil. So your plant might have access to these cations easily. But at the same time, you will have to pay more attention to the balances that you have in your fertilization. Like I told you, the presentation gets more complicated as we go. So now you got to pay attention to the balances that you have with your bases. In this case, it's going to be your calcium, magnesium, and potassium. Because how do the plants uptake these cations? For a plant to actually uptake potassium, what it does is that within the system of the plant, it's going to drop a hydrogen. So by dropping the hydrogens are positive. Then the system within the plant is going to get more negative than it used to be, right? So it creates an imbalance. And the soil is going to compensate that by basically allowing the plant to move something positive back to the system. Hopefully potassium, if that was the case that the plant was hoping for. But the plant doesn't know how the potassium molecule looks like, compared to the calcium or compared to the magnesium. So when I say pay attention to the balances, is if you have a situation where you have a lot of free calcium out there, it might be the case that is going to block your potassium. So that is the issue with the balances out there. The plant doesn't necessarily have a way to uptake exclusively potassium or exclusively calcium in many cases. It's mostly a balance in the soil and an imbalance of charges. So that's why it's our job to make sure that your fertilization is really well balanced, especially in conditions where you have a high cation exchange capacity, because now those cations are being held by the soil and they're there. If they leach out, if you have a low cation exchange capacity, maybe you don't have to worry about that, because at the end of the day, it's likely that the soil profile is going to, get cleaned out every once in a while. But it's just something to keep in mind. That has to be, to do a little bit with the hardiness of the water too, which hardiness basically means carbon and carbon forms that are going to be available in the water, and also calcium and magnesium. So again, that is going to be playing a role in your balance of the nutrients. So just an extra layer of complexity that you can find out there if you're really trying to fine-tune the way you you manage your irrigation. Just being said, although I'm giving you the example of potassium, in this case, if you have a hard water, adding more potassium not necessarily fix the problem, right? It's about managing the balance of potassium, calcium, and magnesium that is going to really help you, not necessarily increasing the rate, which is something, for example, that happens a lot with calcium in vegetables. In vegetables, if you see blossom and rot, most people think that is calcium, I need to add more. But in many cases, you already have enough calcium. It's just a matter of how much water you are adding to make that calcium available and allow the plant to actually uptake it. So again, just another example where the situation is not necessarily resolved by increasing the rate of whatever nutrient you're trying to add. Rather, a good analysis and adequate management of your irrigation tends to fix most things. The last one, I call it the overlooked middle child, is magnesium. Because it's just out there, the plants need them. It's really important. It's going to be the center of the chlorophyll, but we don't tend to pay much attention to it. Just want to bring to your attention. Pay attention to magnesium. Sometimes you might see deficiencies out there that you might think is something else, and likely you're just looking at magnesium. The plant doesn't use a ton of it. The rates are fairly low compared to potassium, for example, and nitrogen, but it's definitely important to have it in the system. So, things to keep in mind, the bases are pretty important because they're always playing around, they're always balancing each other in the soil. Nitrogen is going to drive the demand of many of these bases. So if you're lacking nitrogen, it doesn't matter that you're balancing your bases really well. At the end of the day, the plant doesn't have enough energy to actually grow and use those bases for the rest of the processes. All this is connected to the soil texture. So soil texture tends to be this abstract concept that we just know what kind of texture we have, but there's a ton of stuff that comes behind that. So again, talk to your agents, talk to your specialists. If you have more questions about how to kind of manage your irrigation and fertilization, if you see any issues. And takeaways, there's a ton of them. But again, at the end of the day, I would say if you need to remember something, you need to balance irrigation and fertilization. If you do those two, I would say 60% of the gains already win. For the irrigation, pay attention to flowering and fruit set, especially in watermelons. And your testing, I will say, of the soil and your water. Those two, and manage with the right frequency, should give you the results that you're expecting for your final yield. And with that, I think I made 30 minutes, so you guys might get time to get to the trade show early. Yeah. Do you guys have any questions? And thank you for staying, by the way. I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes. So when it's ripening, basically, right? Usually those rates at that point, they're going to decrease. The plant's not using as much nitrogen, for example, anymore. In many vegetables, you might see curves where they're coming down by 20%, which is usually also matched by the irrigation water consumption. So in many cases, you don't really have to do much because that is not necessarily creating an issue for the plant, but you can definitely decrease the amount of nitrogen specifically that you're using because most of the nutrients the plant needs are already there. It's just a matter of the time that the enzymes kind of need to turn that into sugars that we consume later. So if you're looking for, you're talking about the second harvest where you're really coming close to this is done, I tend to just not fertilize for the last week and a half. I just cut it off because it's not necessarily going to be used for the plant. And the plant can even turn a little yellowish. It doesn't matter because you're just looking for that last fruit, right? So why would I keep a plant that is really green and bright? Yeah. But that's just my experience, with vegetables. Any other question? I think they get it. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. I just have to